Thank you so much to the readers. So before I get started, I just want to recognize and honor the Mississauga Anishinaabe people whose land that we live and work on, and all of their leadership over the past year, alongside us at the Church of the Holy Trinity, along with all of our Haudenosaunee community members, and also the members of our Black communities, the Somali community especially, that's been a big part of our work. And I just also want to give thanks to Joe Connolly and for all of her work at Inner City Family Health Teams, and also to all of our people presence volunteers and leaders who have supported and made so much good come in this time. It's just I want to offer great thanks before I start this homily, to honor this land that we work on, but also all the people around us in community. So after 550 days of community-based disaster relief work centered in Toronto's downtown east side, Unity Kitchen is now slowly beginning our transition out of emergency response and into a more regular rhythm of community support for the fall. And unfortunately, it goes into an uncertain future. We move into the fall with the intention to celebrate what together as a community we have accomplished, and to think about what comes next for us. Most importantly, what is needed in our downtown core. We will be changing our schedule to continue to serve fresh meals Tuesday to Friday from 11:30 to 1 p.m., as well as harm reduction, hygiene, and well-being equipment and other supplies. We will also continue to hold feasts and events to support groups who are interested in using our kitchen and our spaces, and to provide crisis counseling, cultural, and spiritual support with our partners as requested. Over 550 days, we served more than 75,000 home-cooked meals, often working on weekends and holidays with our dedicated team, and many of you played a critical role in this. We collected and gave out several thousand tents, sleeping bags, mountains of clothing appropriate to the weather, lots and lots of things that people need to get through very difficult times. I see this as an immense success that was rooted in the simple act of staying with our community, as so many things they depended on were shuttered. People's presence paved the way for this to answer the call to stay present with God's people. And you might think that this support was primarily targeted towards the houseless or those living on the street. But during this time, we saw how many different people were on the verge of that reality or were unable to meet their basic needs. They say that there was a K-shaped curve in terms of stability caused by COVID, where the wealthy were able to sustain lifestyles of safety, and for the middle and lower classes, life became much, much harder. Likewise, a K-shaped recovery demonstrates that life will not get easier, as the cost of living has shot up dramatically without a plan of support to bring people back up from the impact of COVID. This became boldly obvious in the stories we heard from so many who lost their housing, who rode the bus all night for shelter, who lost their job, or who became disconnected from their support. Yet so many of these folks found sanctuary here with us, a place in the city where hope lived, where they were seen, where they could find something to get them through. Our primary goal to meet the need, but through this time, what ultimately emerged was the importance of our relationship to our collective survival and to our well-being. What could we provide between each of us to create some safety for the day? What could we see in each other that made a future space, that expanded a narrowing event horizon in people's lives? This became the ethos. How can we see a future in the midst of such dangerous and hopeless present moment? We began as a collection of different interfaith groups and houseless people, then joined by others on the fringes, the outcasts and the marginalized, who were then joined by the activists, artists, students, and seniors. Each brought their own gifts, which could contribute to the whole, along with their needs and desires. Together, we shaped each day, contributing to an expansion of time. When so many felt that they had lost their future, we were called to be radically present. At Unity Kitchen, a young person who identifies as a cat worked alongside a highly regimented type A person who created a regimented food serving station like a command center of a battleship. It worked. It was never perfect or easy, but it worked. Elizabeth would tell me that community is not easy. When we would get frustrated with the moment, our people's tensions would rise and we would have to calm the storm. They would tell me community is hard and we would laugh about it. It drew us all deeper into relationship, but it also drew us deeper into hope as we created a wacky normalcy that allowed for the next day and the day after that. Eventually, we started thinking in weeks, which I felt like was a big success, that there was enough thrust underneath us to make a plan for bigger things, making what could be mundane events like vaccination or testing into festivals, bringing people together in the joy of seeing one another in a safe way. People came to see the possibility of this, and it went out through the world. The inspiration was infectious, and we watched other groups slowly emerge into action in our downtown core. We felt like our ambitions could grow bigger, to bring people together, be a meeting place that was outside of the system narratives of what was possible. And I have two really proud accomplishments that came from this route and this time, that we were the first to act, sustaining our energy for such a long time with so many challenging forces around us. And beyond this, that there was so much art that seemed to come from all directions around us, in shows and banners and paintings, ephemera. There are millions of souvenirs that will mark this time and what gave shape to who we were and what we had to say. Jim Houston's banner of a man in a tent with the looming silhouette of a police officer drew ire from the powers that be. Good art does that, and we were not so subtle in our direct messages to those we knew were coming around to discipline us. This dialectical relationship between change making and reductive measures was a positive force. It visibilized so much and asked each of us, what side are you on? Is your place in the community to uplift, or is it to oppress? And the dire circumstances of COVID left little room in the middle. This too expanded time because there was a sense of wanting to be on the right side of history, thinking about how all of our actions would be perceived in a yet to happen future place. Over this time, we went through a period of immense social upheaval that posed these questions too. They unfolded all around us, from Black Lives Matter to the Afro-Indigenous rising protests that formed at City Hall, to the push for defunding police and developing community safety practices, to the uncovering of mass child graves at residential schools and the impact that this has had on survivors. We were present through all of this and had to adapt our ways, our hearts, and our service to suit these emerging issues. Again, this came at a time when no one was in the downtown core but us and our communities. I remember all the shops that barricaded themselves at the threat of a Black Power uprising that would take all the designer handbags to overthrow the police. When no one came to rip down their walls, the hoardings were unceremoniously retired shortly thereafter. The absurdity of fear of the other marked the tone of that day. I also remember that the summer when there was a push to defund police, that we had to abruptly figure out how to deal with difficult and aggressive behaviors. That felt like we're somehow channeled into our square. We had to work together to find an approach to de-escalation, and this took time to finesse. It took time to find the sorts of nurturing and diffusion of these issues. Each were unique, and we had to be resolved in our values and where we felt like we were heading to accomplish this. What we now know was that the police in fact pushed folks to the edge of their sanity and then moved them into the AIR encampment, Afro-Indigenous Rising encampment at Nathan Phillips Square in an attempt to disrupt their efforts, who then quickly moved those folks across the street to Trinity Square. We were left with the heavy lifting. Ultimately, this led to the further funding of police in new and invasive ways. The increased police powers meant that groups of 12 officers on bike would arrive in the square, harassing and detaining our community members for trivial issues like missing court for minor offenses at the court that was not open at this time. This included CBSA, Canadian Border Services Agency, arriving in the early days of the pandemic to serve immigration warrants on several people in our community present in Canada for years or decades. This came at a time when COVID was mounting and the custody facilities at Pearson Airport were already full to the brim. We had to push and push and push the police out of the square to stop these frivolous actions against vulnerable people. We unintentionally, through this, created a zone in which policing was not accepted, mirroring what had happened in Portland and other places around the continent. This too required much commitment and work to ensure that in the absence of police, that there was a baseline of respect and safety. This isn't to say that things were always safe, but we managed to find the right ways to give space to peace on a community level and the right people whose gifts were resolving conflict. Not surprisingly, these folks were often the most criminalized by police, who, when given the space and opportunity, wanted to offer peace to this world. And COVID did ravage us. Even though we were able to prevent any community transmission around us, there were deaths, to overdose, to cold, to violence, to age. Many of these deaths we have yet to mark with ceremony. Some of the reason for this is that we were so inundated with what was in front of us and so perilously dancing on the edge of plague and crisis that there wasn't the space. Our community members were dying too fast. The emotional and mental space required to make these things happen, only now are we fully able to take stock of who is here and who is gone. Sandra and Lee from Toronto Urban Native Ministry have been offering funeral services, sometimes memorials for 2 at a time. We also saw the morgue fill up with bodies, unnamed and unclaimed, only a few of which are reported and were recognized on our homeless memorial each month. The celebration of life that we aspire to as Christians was dimmed by our own need just to survive. These are mirrored by the intangible losses that happened during this time to us and in our communities. The sense of who we were before is shattered into pieces. It almost doesn't make sense within me, and the notion of returning or reopening has left me with the need to rediscover who I am. I know this is shared by so many who were isolated or who had to respond for the well-being of their families or others. These things are hard to describe. We shed a part of us, and I know many are hoping to put back on their same costumes, finding that now they do not fit us anymore. We are encouraging our community members, staff, and volunteers to notice the energies that have lived in their bodies during this time. We know that many of us hold deep feelings of anxiety, shock, trauma, and loss that remain with us, even as we begin to find some normalcy within an emergency. We are working to acknowledge the level of panic that the intersecting COVID-19, drug poisoning, and housing crises have landed in our communities and our supporters. None of which are getting better, none of which are getting easier. We are living into an age of crisis, which is being written on our bodies through the tone of panic, hyper alertness, rigid focus, gripping for stability. There's a primal scream inside us that is releasing in every breath, whether we recognize it or not. Much of this has to do with the lack of language for us to adequately express the feelings resting within us. Our feelings and expressions that led us to work in this relational way become contrary to the status quo. It's hard now moving towards a place where some rest is possible and time is stretching out a little bit more to find a release from these things, when they are rooted in the difficult experiences we face simply helping our communities to survive. This notion of community relief was very quickly rejected by the powers that be, almost from the inception of our efforts. For example, there's a table that meets each week composed of major stakeholders in the downtown core, the developers, the building managers, city staff, and major business owners, a meeting to figure out how they could create a state of normal business once again. I was encouraged when we were invited to be part of this table to soon find out that we were there to be reined in. The Young Dundas BIA uses images of the church with tents around it in their presentation of perceptions of public safety in the downtown core to demonstrate, which was pointed out on a weekly basis, how we together have created an environment that was of ill repute. And as it turns out, through subsequent high-level meetings with city managers and department heads, now we are being called upon by the city and others for our expertise in managing difficult people, handling overdose, and as the pressure of our work increased, they begin to understand that we weren't the source of unsafety, but quelling a tide of even greater crisis now present through our downtown core. But on January 1st, we will return our kitchen to Trinity Square Cafe, who have supported our work throughout the pandemic and continue to pay their rent, which helps keep things rolling along. And it feels like at this time, as we are wrapping up what was Unity Kitchen, I know when I tell this to groups throughout our community that this thought has been met with real sadness and worry about the hole we will leave in the downtown core. People describe not just the loss of an anchor of services, but the loss of a culture that became home to so many, that led to organizations being created for Black and Indigenous and trans communities that are now superstars doing amazing things, that led to people being launched into life, prisoners just returning home, finding us as a bridge to full-time work, young people learning what their gifts are and who they are, people finding meaning and place in our weird and whimsical ways. Houseless people becoming activists and finding the support to significantly change the system to provide for their best interests, and us finding our critical lens to be taken seriously as we set best practices that change the way the system offers, often aligned with oppression, needs to see and treat people. This grassroots energy is so potent and a marker of who Holy Trinity has always been, and yet we don't know yet what comes next, that there is no roadmap for after January. This all came out of acting during an emergency, and thankfully that action led us to cultivate so many wonderful things. And in ending, we want this energy to go somewhere, elsewhere into the world in inspiration of what we have done. This will take community conversation and discussion. What would you like to happen next? Who else should we ask? How do we hear from all of those outside our tight-knit community about how they see themselves as part of Holy Trinity now? And how do we hold up droves of people that found themselves here during this time? There's a question mark about how do we invite them in. And we know that worship is probably not going to be that space. So there is a big question mark on how we bring these discussions forward in a way that continues to grow our community and who we would like to be in the face of these growths. It's a bittersweet dialogue because there's much that we need to be proud of, much that we can still do, and much that we will need to leave undone. We also know that as we move to conclusion, we have been and are entering further into another crisis, the magnitude of which we have never experienced. Visible in catastrophic storms and fires and floods, our climate crisis is searingly present in my mind. It is so difficult for my generation or ones after me to imagine a future for ourselves. That's a painful statement that when I talk to my peers, there is no joy or hope in what's to come. What a brutal reality we have been asked to embrace. And sadly, as I have been speaking to, it's one among the many crises that we are being asked to hold in front of us, shunted from generation to generation after many years of neglect. This is simply a fact of our existence that we need to deal with, seemingly with little recognition, support, or fundamental action from our leaders. And yet through our emergency response and through the actions of so many projects and groups like ours, we are beginning to see a roadmap of how to live in times of crisis, how to adapt our hearts and minds to let go of notions of perfection, to be truly present with people, to live through our relationships, to embrace the flow of possibility, to let go of power or control, to let the gifts of others shine, and to uplift what is spoken to us in need and desire as compass directions. Each of these elemental forces, things that we often forget, entwine us with the first forces of creation. I really like this notion of expanding time, expanding future as an adaptation to crisis. Feelings of hopelessness seem to compact time, to limit us to present or past. We remember in this season of creation that God's dream sparked our beginning, with the power of this energy to create an ever-expanding future space. In the action of this energy, there are no barriers able to withstand this force. From the first moment of existence, we are within this force, God's presence in our universe. We are tied to this in every moment, and our witness of this brings us into hope consciousness, a momentum we need to heal our earth, heal our city, and heal ourselves. I encourage us to hold hold this idea together as we begin to think about what comes next for our parish and our community, that in each day we have the opportunity to offer this to the world. I encourage each of us to see this in the gifts that we offer. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.